Hi there, Joe. Joe, can you hear me okay? Joe, can you hear me all right? No, I can't hear you. Can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Yeah, no, I can't hear you yet. So let's just test 1 2.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Still no.
Now I can hear you. Yep. All right, it's working.
Okay.
All right. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Is that all right? Is that working okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's a little delay, but I can hear you fine.
All right, great. All right, well, look, nice to be able to spend some time with you today. So, you know, essentially I've got all of the reports in front of me. So, you know, whatever questions you want to ask and prepare for your class. So I'm happy with whatever you'd like to do with this time that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've tried to think of some stuff. I guess one thing, can you kind of give an overview of just the disc profiles, just what they're looking at actually, how it was developed, maybe a little bit how it's used commonly?
Yeah, so to go back to the original development of the profile, so DISC was first developed back in 1928. It was written by a man called William Moulton Marston. He was a behavioralist. Up until that point in time, a lot of the work done to understand people was done to understand what people's disorders were with their personality as such. And so, he noticed that people with even the same personality would also behave quite differently in different situations. So he thought about the influence of the environment and how that impacts behavior. And being a behavioralist, he was always, today we would recognize it as a growth mindset in terms of, understanding that the environment does impact how people behave. People can behave in different ways if they choose to, and ultimately, he wrote a book and he noticed that people did fall into some patterns of behavior. So he only measures the DIS and C, the dominance, influence, steady, and conscientious behavioral pattern. You can measure any behavioral pattern you like, but he noticed that that was a pattern that everyone had to some degree in common. And essentially, that's where the profile was born. It was never patented or copyrighted. The work that he did, it wasn't like Myers-Briggs, which is a psychometric personality profile, which was patented and copyrighted and got quite a lot of traction, as did some other personality profiles. DISC was used for commercial purposes. It was further enhanced and developed in the 70s and 80s to the point where today it's become the most valid and reliable behavioral profile available to the market. And so what's that seen it's happen is that essentially a lot of the large corporate organizations, Fortune 500 companies will use DISC as part of their recruitment process these days. Here in Australia, in Europe, in America, in Asia, it's literally become a prolifically used profile around the world. And they've got it down to a pretty good degree. Even we will use the profile to help recruit certain employees. If we were looking for an accountant, there's a profile that's been proven that is more likely to produce effective behavior as in that context of that role. And because we are talking about behaviors, we are looking at, if we have a job description, there is a certain type of profile that fits the different roles that people occupy within the context of their work. So DISC is sort of developed over the time. What we did is that we developed the world's only sporting version of DISC, because you do talk about people's behavior in a certain context. We thought that when we talk about athletes, that it's useful to give them something specific to their sport, sport managers, coaches, athletes. So we developed the 3 different profiles about 14 years ago now. We've now profiled in excess of 50,000+ people. We've got the largest, essentially the largest database of athletes, coaches, and officials, sport managers of anyone in the world now. And we don't use that for any purpose, other than, working with our clients, essentially. When we look at profiles in terms of, coaching or athlete effectiveness, that's what's interesting about DISC, is that there's not a profile which is going to guarantee you more or less success. The biggest point of commonality that we've seen amongst all the different profiles is that, coaches and leaders and athletes too, that are more adaptable tend to get better results. You can't control the environment that you're in all the time, but if you can adapt successfully to it, then that's going to help you achieve better outcomes. And, ultimately it's the same as a leader as well. Leaders being able to effectively alter their behaviors to suit their followers, to suit the situation that they're leading in.
Great. I guess as far as our group of students that we have right now, it's almost probably 50-50 between people who are either currently in coaching, have been in it a little bit, are brand new into coaching, like graduate assistants, or people who are athletic administrators now, or who want to get into college athletics. Could you talk a little bit about how maybe those two different groups, maybe the difference between a coach using that profile versus maybe somebody like an athletic director using that profile?
Yeah, so essentially in terms of the difference in the profile, we find that athletic administrators, coaches, athletes they're just a normal population of people. So when we look at what I call your team dynamic, for example, and you look at the number of DIS and C profiles that you have within that dynamic, in a normal population, you get about 9% of that population that are Ds. You actually have 0% in your group that are naturally high in their level of D. You do have people that have secondary levels of D in their profile. You've got a couple of those, or a few of those actually. There's a roughly 27% of the population is I. In your group, it's 38%, so you have a slight oversupply of that profile. 52% is the normal population of S's. You've got a slight undersupply there at 38. And the C population is normally 12, and yours is around 23%, so it's slightly over for that. So it's not exactly a normal population, but it's very difficult to find a perfectly normal population. I mean, people do get attracted to certain environments for their own respective reasons. There are some times where we work with, a football team or a soccer team, for example, or a water polo team that has a significant oversupply of some of the profiles. Whether you're going into coaching or administration, it doesn't so much change the profile that you're likely to have. Certainly, as you boil down into the specific roles, though, we do notice that if you're a head coach, the type of profile that a head coach would stereotypically have would be different to the type of profile that an assistant coach would have. And that's determined by the type of job. But having said that, we do have head coaches that have a profile that a typical assistant coach might have, but they're very effective at being able to adapt the behaviors to suit what's required, given that they're now in charge and they're a head coach. The same goes for athletic administrators. We've worked with a number of, for example, people in significant leadership roles, athletic directors, and the list goes on. And we've found that they are all different types of profiles. It's not their profile which is going to determine their success. It's literally their ability to adapt to the role and what the role demands. And so I think that's the key thing here, is that when you look at, for example, the role of an assistant coach is vastly different, or a graduate coach is vastly different to the role of the head coach. Now, if you want to be a head coach, as I said, it doesn't so much matter what your profile is. It matters that you understand what your preferred behaviors are, so that you can adapt and change those behaviors where necessary, or even use them if they're a critical part of the role. But to be able to do that in the context of whatever job you're looking for. Some profiles will have to adapt more than others. There are some natural profiles that fit any sort of leadership role. There are certain, for example, the dominance profile is one that naturally likes to be in charge. And so you therefore find them in authority positions. Does it make them good at it? No, it just means that they like that. It's a preference that they have. The same as you often find that high Is gravitate towards creative industries where they can communicate with lots of people and drive energy levels on the team and come up with lots of different ideas. If you don't have that in your profile, it's not an issue. It just means that you would have to adapt that behavior. So we often find a lot of coaches in recruitment, for example, especially as an assistant coach, that's often one of their strengths, is connecting with future athletes and students and essentially building a relationship with them and connecting them to the program. And the same we say for assistant coaches, for example, where you get a lot of S's and C's in assistant coach roles, because S's are steady, they're naturally supportive, C's are conscientious, they're very good with taking care of the details, so planning practices, making sure that things run on time, administratively being effective and efficient. They're all the qualities that a lot of head coaches want in their assistant coaches. Analyzing video, film, data, stats, they're all behaviors that profile does naturally well. All right. So again, it's not so much what your profile is, it's understanding it and then knowing where am I going to have to adapt. Because I don't know any head coaches that become head coaches. Well, I know one, that was a long time ago. She became a head coach basically on day one. But essentially most head coaches were assistant coaches at some point.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I guess probably the thing that I want our group to get out of this more than anything is the reason I chose to do it is one of the last, I guess, assignments they're going to do in the class is basically kind of do a self-profile of assessment based on their DISC assessment. And so I guess what I would like to know is how can somebody take all this information and put it into practice on how to learn, how to communicate better with people, how to just to do their job better.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some key pages within the report. I mean, ultimately, that's exactly what we're doing with the profile when we work with the student athlete or professional athlete. So, an interesting thing to think about is what we call a behavioral scorecard. And essentially what that is looking at what are the strengths in my behaviors. What are those behaviors that, when I say strengths, they're the behaviors that you most prefer to do. And because you prefer to do them, you tend to get good at them. And then thinking about how those behaviors relate to whatever role that I'm looking to perform in the future. And it could be your ultimate role, or it could be the first part of that step towards that ultimate role. So I get students and athletes to basically write down like perhaps 5 behaviors that they do. So that could be the ability to be direct in solving a problem. So if you've got a lot of D in your profile, you like to solve problems in a really direct way. Well, what situations will that behavior create an effective result? So we use that situation times behavior equals result model, showing that each of these behaviors are useful in the context of a certain situation and a certain environment. So I've got a great ability to solve problems directly and quickly and perhaps even autonomously. What type of role would that be well suited for? Well, perhaps you could see that would be quite a great strength to have. If you're for example, a head coach and, ultimately the decision is yours around team selection. You've got a deadline which is pressing. Something unusual just happened. You don't have time to discuss it with everyone else. You've got to make a call on this. So there's lots of scenarios that you can think about. And so basically writing down, say, 5 of those core behaviors that when you look through your report, they clearly stand out as being your most preferred ways of behaving. Thinking about situations where those behaviors, when you use them, give you a quality outcome. You can also, instead of just scanning and searching through your report, there's some pages on 22 or 23. It starts on page 23, goes to around 26, and it's called your 12 sub-patterns. This is the shortcut to that. And basically what we look at is we've broken the D, I, S, and C behaviors into 3 core behaviors for each one. And it's related to whether you're high in D or high in I. It measures the difference between your high points and low points and creates a more in-depth understanding of your behaviors. It's all written there. You don't sort of have to know how it worked that out. It just lists your 12 top behaviors. So behaviors 1, 2, and 3, again, they would go into your scorecard as behaviors that you use a lot. And it literally ranks them in terms of how often you use the behaviors and the strength to which you use those behaviors. Again, you can think about, well, when does that behavior work well for you? But I also want people to think about the flip side to that. I want them to realize, when does that autonomous problem-solving behavior, when does that not work so well? So perhaps if we're, planning our schedule out and we decide to do it by ourselves at the preseason, when we actually had time to consult with all of our, perhaps our student athletes had a decision in that, but you didn't consult with them, or even your assistant coaches and fellow coaches, they've got their own say on how we should do things, but because of your directive and autonomous problem-solving nature, you don't consult with those people. And what impact does that have on the relationship you now have with your team members? And so what we find is that all of our strengths can also, if we overuse that behavior, and we typically will because it is a behavior that we literally prefer and like to do, it will give us negative outcomes. And so what then should we adapt? And so out of those 12 behaviors, you'll then search through and find out, well, in that situation, I needed to adapt my behavior to one which was going to be more accommodating of listening to others' concerns, for example. And then we look at all the way down in that scorecard activity where you've got your strength behaviors and how they work well for you. When do you overuse them? We also want you to look at your most adaptive behaviors. So your adaptive behaviors are often your least preferred behaviors. So in those 12 sub-patterns, because you've got 12 of these behaviors, you might pick behaviors 10, 11, and 12 and realize that I don't do those behaviors often, but they're just as useful. It's just finding a situation where you can use them. And sometimes even in the class, this will definitely happen in your class, you'll get some people whose top 3 behaviors will be someone else's bottom 3 behaviors, and vice versa. So you can get someone else to help you with that and share your results with others and learn where they might use one of those behaviors as a preference where it's your lowest preference. But we want them again to think about that situation, the behavior, the result that they're trying to achieve, and try to match up which behavior is going to be most effective. So it's a little bit like, I use the analogy of a builder that goes to work and has 12 tools in their toolkit, or any profession that has 12 tools in their toolkit. To use all those 12 tools, you've got to know that you actually have them all there. The fact is that like an athlete who has developed strong technical proficiency in a certain part of their sport, if they don't know that they've got proficiency in doing it a different way, they're not going to call on that when they need to. And the same goes for leaders, for coaches, for anyone in their role. If they don't realize that these 12 tools are in their toolkit and are available to them, they will continuously go to their top 3 or 4 tools and subsequently use them when they're not so helpful.
Great. So how can, a part I enjoyed a lot was seeing the kind of people you were compatible with, their style versus not compatible. Can you talk a little bit about that just in the context and maybe within a team context or just within employer relationship kind of stuff?
Yeah, so when we talk about compatibility, we're not talking about social compatibility. We're talking about compatibility towards, some workplace environment where we're trying to achieve an outcome. The reality is that either the profiles will conflict with others based on their different behavioral needs and priorities. So for example, a D behavior is very direct, they're dominant, they like to be in control, they make decisions easily and quickly by looking at the big picture facts, and they're fast paced. Then you look at another profile that is the opposite to that, and in the model here, the DISC model, you see that S's are the complete opposite to that. So they will make decisions through consensus. They'll consider the human side of that decision. They like to take their time and be patient and think through it and have lots of time to analyze and debate it. You can see how a D would clash with that. But what's interesting about the behavioral clashes is that some profiles, namely the D and the I profile, because they're also, typically if they've got an issue, they voice it and they outwardly voice their concerns to others. So if you've got an issue with them and a clash with them, they will let you know. Whereas the S profile and the C profile, they're a lot more indirect, so they're not going to actually complain about these things. So you may not always realize if you're working with a S profile who is steady and slower paced and patient and tolerant, that you actually have a clash with them. So the DS combination can actually be a fairly effective combination, as can the CS, as can the IS profile. But it's because the S is looked at upon being the building blocks, the glue that can bond any team together. So when we work with a team, if they don't have at least what we're looking at with your team here, 35% S, when it starts to drop below that, you get much more individualistic behavior where you will have more clashes. If you've got a lot of S in your profile as a team, you'll have less clashes just because the S's are malleable. They find it easy to work with others. They're flexible. They're supportive. Whereas the other profiles have much higher need for more individualistic behaviors. The Ds can clash with the Is. The Is are very extroverted. They're talkative. They like to communicate a lot. They like to socialize. They drive energy. They make decisions in a more intuitive way. Ds will clash with them because Ds are much more on task, results driven, and have a high need to get an outcome very, very quickly without a lot of, communication, debate, and discussion about anything that doesn't relate to the task. And so Is can get frustrated with that behavior, and Ds can get frustrated with the Is' lack of connection, or the Is will get frustrated with the Ds' lack of connection to them as a person. The Cs, again, if you look at the Is and the Cs, both will frustrate each other. The Cs won't necessarily say a lot about it, though. They'll keep it to themselves, but Cs are very detail focused. They like to look at all the facts. They like to look at the numbers. Is make decisions in a very intuitive, fast-paced way. Well, that's just not going to work if you're working with a C. And so you could pick any number of, topics: how we communicate, how we make decisions, how we provide leadership, what role do we have on a team, even with athletes, how do we play the game, and look at any number of areas there where there are potential clashes. What we try to help people understand is that all of these behaviors are necessary. They are more or less important depending upon the situation and the context of that particular role that we're in. But if you're an athlete and you're a high C and you're playing alongside a high I, it's really helpful to understand them better, because you know that they're going to play a more intuitive game, and they should know that you're going to play a more structured game. And as a result of that, you can have conversations about how are we going to play together. And so a lot of behavioral clashes happen not because there's natural clashes within the model. They happen because people never communicate and they don't understand each other well. As soon as they start to communicate and develop that understanding, an I can actually love playing alongside a C because they love the fact that they know the play, that they can even remind them about the play. They love the fact that they're reliable. They're going to be in the spot that they're supposed to be in. And the Cs can actually start to love the fact that you're an I because you're going to take an opportunity when you see it. If there's a gap, you're going to hit that gap. Coaches that can make intuitive decisions about things. So the point is that the clashes stop becoming clashes when we start to value the difference that each of the profiles bring to a team. And to realize that if we had a team, for example, that lacked diversity, I've never ever seen a team that lacks diversity, so that is, that has a massive oversupply of a certain profile, be successful. Not really successful. Not winning national championships successful. We looked at all of the teams that we've worked with that have won national championships, professional championships over a period of time. And those teams had quality diversity. They had each profile represented. And because of the work that they did with us, they understood the value that each profile brought to the team. So that should be part of our leadership role, is to essentially help people to understand that.
And so that's really on, I guess, the leader of a department or a head coach to try to recognize that and I guess educate their players or their employees on how they would work with each other.
Yeah.
Kind of what you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I do this in sport. I do it in business. Earlier this week here, I had 50 mining executives for a large company all do their profile and all discuss strategies on how to work with each other more effectively and just start to, the building blocks. None of them have seen this before. And there are a lot of leaders that are in their 30s and 40s that have never studied how are people similar and how are people different. And what works for me, I didn't realize that didn't work for you. So you tell me now, well, what does work for you? Because you and I have to work together for the benefit of the company. And we always look at, well, this is not about me adapting. It's not about you adapting. It's not about even meeting in the middle. There might be times where my behavior is the best choice or your behavior is the best choice. And I have to massively adapt, or you do in that moment. But the decision making comes around, what is best for the organization right now? Okay, so what are we trying to achieve? You know, and based on what we're trying to achieve, an agreement over that, well, let's just pick the best behavior, which is going to give us that outcome. So what should our decision making be? If we've got a lot of time to think and consider and weigh up the pros and cons, well, that's what we should do if there's a lot of complexity behind the decision. But for fundamental day-to-day decisions, to do that process every single time, yeah, that may not be so effective because things just won't get done. But the point is that I still find it interesting that you get managers in high-level organizations that don't have a good understanding of this. You know, you get student athletes that have never been exposed to this concept ever before, and you know, even professional athletes that have never ever seen this sort of thing. We work with professional football teams and baseball teams, and you know, the list goes on, and people have never been taught how to understand other people. And that's essentially what happened to me as an athlete. You know, no one ever taught me this stuff. You know, I discovered it when I started doing corporate work and leadership work for organizations, and this is a tool that they all used. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. This definitely helps me understand my behaviors and how they clash with my team members, because I'm sure they're not the same as me. And then it helped me to understand what their behaviors were, so I could try and work more effectively with them. And the good thing was, it got better outcomes. It made my life a lot less stressful, and yeah, it helped us achieve better results on the water and, you know, as a team.
So you said that earlier that you used it to recruit employees for certain positions.
Yeah.
Have you had coaches use it to recruit players?
We have. We don't suggest that a certain profile is going to be more or less skillful or talented than another profile. But if, for example, we've got a team which is like yours, in this dynamic here, and we go, well, there's no one who's naturally a high level of D. We do have a solid population of I's with those 5 people I've got in my group here. We really should be looking at recruiting someone who can bring some of that natural level of dominance. We've got some, you know, ID profiles in the group. We have to be a little bit careful there, but we don't really want to populate that I quadrant anymore if we can avoid it. So if we've got 2 players that are equally talented, skillful, the type of role that we want them to play, if it's a basketball team and we're looking for another point guard, you know what, we might want a point guard who's got some D in their profile. If the other point guards are very different to that, maybe they're SC profiles, because they will play the game entirely differently. If we have a really high population of a certain dynamic, then we want to try and not add to that. But it's hard because a lot of coaches don't understand this. A lot of the people that do the recruiting don't understand it, and they often will recruit similar versions of themselves. And so that's how you end up with this quite skewed population of certain profiles. And then you think that when you end up starting to develop a skewed dynamic, what happens is that starts to create a life of its own, because that dynamic behaves in a certain way. So let's say that they're I's and they're having a great time. Other people see that, you know, student athletes that are looking to come to that university, they watch film, they see how they play, they notice how they interact, and they say, wow, they look like they're having a great time. That looks like a lot of fun. There's a lot of energy. It's a lot of things that appeal. It's like walking down the street and there's 4 types of restaurants. There's a place where you can go in, order your meal, sit down, it's high quality, and you can get out of there really quick. That might suit a high D. A restaurant which is loud and noisy and has atmosphere and a lot of variety on the menu, that suits an I. You know, a quieter place where you can actually have a conversation with someone and get to know maybe the owner of the restaurant, that might suit an S. And a restaurant that has, you know, a reputation for quality and, you know, a great, very niche specific menu, which is well organized and structured and formal environment, that might suit a C. So you do get to choose where you go. And so, yeah, that does impact the dynamic that you end up with, because people start self-selecting. And so when we look at career choices, you know, this is part of the challenge, is that you have a lot of athletes and students that want to pursue a career, but the reality is that their dream job and the profile to do that role is very different from their initial roles that they would have. And so, you know, they're going to have to adapt at some point, and learn the behaviors. So, yeah.
Do you see with each, I guess, generation of people that you work with, do you see a difference in how they're structured out as far as their disc profile goes between, say, like a baby boomer versus a millennial?
Yeah, we haven't noticed that. So our database obviously is only 14 years old. So that's a generation in itself. It's something that we're just going to have to wait and see. From a disc theoretical perspective, you know, how social structures organize themselves. I think that you would see a similar demographic from whenever to this point in time. What I do think you see is that the environment does start to alter things. So what people adapt to could potentially start to change. I know it seems like today is, you know, less collectivism and more individualistic behaviors, and you know, moving away from creating connections with people, and that certainly influences the way student athletes have communicated and some of the qualities and skills that they bring to teams that they've been on, where coaches will, you know, complain about whether it's a lack of resiliency, or coaches will complain about a lack of an athlete's ability, a young athlete's ability to connect and communicate well with themselves or their team members. And I think that's driven through the environment. So, you know, I think if the environment vastly changes, then because DISC is talking about how someone behaves in the context of that environment, you may start to see some changes. At this stage, we haven't really noticed it yet.
So that was the main stuff I guess I had questions about. I guess what would be your advice for, you know, somebody who's just had this for a week to get the most out of it over this next year that they're in our graduate program?
Yeah, I think the main advice I would have is to, number one, you know, if this was me, I'd start thinking really clearly about that role that I want to occupy when I finish all of my studies. And I would really clearly start to articulate what exactly are the behaviors that are going to see me be successful in that role. So do your research online, but then it's important to start talking to different people who actually have that position and ask them those questions. So on a day-to-day basis, you know, how is it expected that you will interact with people? Do you have a job where you interact with a lot of people? Do you even want that type of job? How are decisions made around here? And start to identify whether those behaviors are natural strengths in you based on what your profile says, or identify behaviors that you're going to have to adapt. And when you find those behaviors where you need to adapt, start developing the ability to do it. So essentially start exposing yourself to situations where that behavior is going to be challenged. You know, it's like someone who, for example, is a low I, and that means they're, you know, less extroverted, more introverted, less interactive. You know, they typically won't speak up in a big group, but if connecting with people and voicing your opinion and speaking up in meetings is an important part of your future role, you better start developing those behaviors now. And you can do that in ways that don't always relate to the job. For example, sitting next to someone on the bus, start having a conversation, say hello, talk about the weather, say something, step outside your comfort zone. If you're in the queue at Starbucks, you know, have a chat to the person in front, engage in a conversation with whoever's serving you your meal. Those little behavioral shifts can actually start to develop a behavior which can later on be something you can more easily adapt towards. So that would be my key advice, is to start to map out your behavioral, your career based on the behaviors required to be in that role, and start mapping out what are those first steps towards that. Identify the behaviors that, I mean, it's no different to an athlete who says, you know, from a skill perspective, I need to be better at X, Y, and Z. Okay, so let's now start, as a coach, you'll start structuring drills and activities at practice to develop those skills. It's exactly the same thing that we can do here.
Perfect.
Yeah. And look, if anyone has any questions or comments and they want to reach out to us with any specific advice or help, you know, my email is coach@athleteassessments, all one word, .com. Or they can look up our website, athleteassessments.com. Reach out to us. We're here to help, and we love to help all of our clients. And that's not just in the next couple of weeks, but at any stage in the future. We often get random emails from the hundreds of classes that we've done now. And, you know, we always like to hear from you, and we're always happy to help.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, pleasure, Joe. You, I hope that goes well. And of course, reach out if we can do anything else. And yeah, we'll stay in touch.
Okay. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Take care. Bye.